Hi, everyone. I am David Lipton from The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. This podcast is about how the U.S. failed to alter the course of history in the Middle East by neglecting to offer Turkey a free trade pact. The setting, Long Island, New York. It is the summer of 2030. My granddaughter, Alicia, and I are walking the Long Island shore, gazing out at the Chinese ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, grandfather, when did we miss the opportunity to reestablish our influence in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East? Alicia, it happened midway through the year 2025. You may recall our earlier talks about the shield of the West crumbling in the election of 2024. The historic roots of the collapse of a U.S. presence is one of the reasons why the Chinese ships are right out there in front of us. In January of 2025, the new U.S. president was inaugurated. Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, won the popular and electoral college vote by a respectable margin. However, a substantial part of the U.S. elite and the people who voted for them did not like or respect the new president. There is no point trying to figure out the reasons why he was so disliked. The political fact was that anything that Trump wanted, either domestically or internationally, the opposition party and their supporters opposed. Moreover, many die-hard never-Trumpers, as they were known in those days, were embedded in the federal and state bureaucracies. But Granddad, why all the international fuss over yet another Arab-Israeli war? After all, the Arabs and the Israelis had been fighting on and off for over 80 years since the establishment of the State of Israel. Well, Alicia, it was a very different kind of war this time. The Israelis had let down their military guard along the Gaza Strip. A terrorist group called Hamas, who were the de facto rulers in those days of the Gaza Strip, launched a successful, bloody, and vicious attack on unsuspecting Israeli citizens, and they killed about 1,200 civilians and took about another 250 hostages after they were driven back into Gaza by the Israeli military. Hamas also launched from Gaza about 5,000 missiles directly into Israel proper. Missiles also rained down on Israel from Iran and its proxy, Hezbollah, in Lebanon, and its Iranian allies, the Houthi, in Yemen. The response by the Israelis was nasty and ruthless. After bombing the Gaza Strip for weeks, they invaded Gaza and reduced much of it to rubble to stop the missiles. Unfortunately, whoever was in the way, that's the civilians, was simply swept aside by both the Israelis and Hamas. After decapitating the Hezbollah leadership in Syria and Lebanon by electronic warfare, the Israelis invaded Lebanon to occupy parts of southern Lebanon and expelled Hezbollah and their Iranian advisors. The invasion was so successful and not only drastically cut down Hezbollah's presence in Lebanon, it also collapsed the Syrian government and its leader, Bashar Assad, ignominiously fled the country for Russia. The Islamist opposition groups that had opposed the Assad family for years filled the political vacuum and took over Syria. The prevailing sentiment in the U.S. was a weariness with the previous 40 years of largely ineffective commitments of military forces, material, and money in dealing with the warlike and cantankerous inhabitants of the Middle East. Isolationism and appeasement were in the air, at least in the West to some extent, and in the U.S., the world sheriff. While the U.S., the world sheriff, and the rest of Western Europe wanted to wash their hands of the entire area, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese, the usual troublemakers, were more than happy to occupy the political vacuum left by the West. This left the Saudi Arabians with their huge oil reserves hung out to dry. The Israelis were increasingly left to their own devices. In early 2025, the new world sheriff, Donald Trump, arrived in town. A measure of leadership by the U.S. was needed most. A dramatic, out-of-the-box opportunity presented itself. the U.S. should have offered to create a free trade agreement with Turkey. There would have been no guarantee that the Turkish government would have seen their interests in that way, but it would have been worth a try and would have made everyone else think about the U.S.'s next steps in that area. Such an agreement would have more closely aligned Turkish, U.S., Western European, and Saudi Arabian interests in the Middle East and Persian Gulf region. Those common interests were political and economic stability in the area. Those interests were opposed to Russian, Iranian, and Chinese troublemaking in the area to advance their influence in that region of the world. Alicia, think about it this way. Draw a clear mental line starting with Saudi Arabia on the Persian Gulf in the south and move northward to Israel, located astride the eastern Mediterranean, and Turkey on the north shore. The strategic goal of a new alignment with Turkey would have been the breaking of a long-standing dynamic of the Middle East. Arab nations had used the Palestinian issue for 80 years to create a destructive dynamic of trying to destroy the state of Israel while deflecting criticism of their own regimes. With a free trade agreement in place, the dynamic of the area would have shifted from incessant Arab-Israeli disputes and wars to an economic and political alignment with the U.S., Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other rich Persian Gulf states. That new alignment would have encouraged more of the Arab states bordering Israel to pivot away from the unrealistic, irredentist claims of the Palestinians for a state of their own at the expense of the state of Israel. True, there was a half-hearted attempt to reboot the Abraham Accords, but that came to nothing. Alas, the Russians, Iranians, and Chinese subsequently used the hapless Palestinians as cannon fodder to advance their own imperial interests in the Middle East. The Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank took the bait. Once the Russians and Iranians and the Chinese got what they wanted, which was to push the U.S. and Western powers out of the area, the Palestinians were cast aside as they always were. The Israelis were left to make the best deal they could. And here we are today in 2030, wondering why it all turned out that way. Well, that's it for now. For a more comprehensive count of how we got to where we are, visit Amazon.com and download The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030.